So, hello.
Добро вечер на сите. Добродојдовте на
In the frames of the project, we are here, future ecologists, actually the Macedonian version of this project, entitled The Touch, which was done in partnership with British Council and Lux, and the exhibition was realized in the National Gallery of the Republic of North Macedonia. So today we are gathered here to follow one interesting webinar, which has a topic when art and science overlap. At the very beginning, I just want to let you know that this session is being recorded, and it has as well a translation on Macedonian. So who wants to listen the whole conversation, which is going to happen on English? To listen the conversation on Macedonian, you can choose down, there is a bottom entitled Interpretation. You click on Interpretation and you choose Macedonian language in order to follow the Macedonian translation. If at the end there is some question on Macedonian, then the translator will give us the answer on English. So these are the short intros before we start with the talk. As I already mentioned, today's topic of the webinar is entitled When Art and Science Overlap. And it talks about inter and transdisciplinarity, which have recently become distinguishing elements of contemporary art. And when borders between disciplines blend together and are erased, very often results are enriching for both disciplines and result in work neither could have predicted. A particular example of a collaboration between practitioners with different specialisms will be the focus of this talk. Today we have two special guests, Elpida Envision, one of the artist participants at the Macedonian version of the Future Ecologists at the exhibition The Touch, and the scientist, Professor Alastair Forbes. So Elpida and Alastair, welcome to today's webinar, and thanks for accepting the invitation to take part at this online discussion and conversation. One of the reasons why I decided to choose such a topic for this online webinar is because Elpida Envision's work can definitely be placed in the field of inter and sometimes even transdisciplinarity. The goal of this talk would be to discuss her practice as well as the many benefits of introducing and overweaving the knowledge of other disciplines into the art practice in general, and in this particular example into her own artistic practice, and to create a better, wider, and more knowledgeable projects with deeper social impact. Her collaboration with Professor Alastair Forbes is going to be discussed and explained today, but she has collaborated with many other professionals from other disciplines too, so she can share with us some other experience as well. So before we start this talk, I would like to give a short intro into the usage of the terms of today's discussion related with this particular topic, disciplinarity. Actually, to make some distinguishment between multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity. Disciplinarity sets knowledge into separate and in many cases dichotomous disciplines, subdisciplines, and specializations, and as a result fragments knowledge. This way of thinking creates definite divides between disciplines. This means that there is a gap in the system requiring a way to describe research that does not fall clearly into one discipline or was pollinated by other disciplines. This type of research is often classed as either multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinary, or transdisciplinary. Niculescu Basarab writes about the difference between inter, multi, and transdisciplinarity, and he says multidisciplinarity concerns itself with studying a research topic in not just one discipline only, but in several at the same time. Any topic in question will ultimately be enriched by incorporating the perspective of several disciplines. The multidisciplinary approach transgresses disciplinary boundaries, while its goal remains limited to within the framework of disciplinary research. Interdisciplinarity has a different goal than multidisciplinarity. It concerns the transfer of methods from one discipline to another. Like multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity transgresses the boundaries of disciplines, while its goal still remains within the framework of disciplinary research. Interdisciplinary even has the capacity to generate new disciplines like quantum cosmology and chaos theory. Transdisciplinarity at the end concerns itself with what is between the disciplines, across the different disciplines and beyond all disciplines. Its goal is the understanding of the present world, of which one of the imperatives is the unity of knowledge. And please give me just few more minutes before we start this conversation to just shortly read our today's panelists' bios. For those that haven't read them already or do not know who Elpida and Alastair are. So Elpida Hadjivasilova is a contemporary visual artist working across sculpture, installation, video, sound, photography, and architectural interventions. Her materials range from the extraordinary to the ordinary, and the ephemeral or the discarded to the highly precious. They include organic matter, foodstuff, and precious metals. Central to her practice is a response to the particularities of a place, its history, local environment, and communities. Hadjivasilova is interested in how the exchange of knowledge might develop through collaborative working and in the context of landscape, heritage, science, and community as offered by each location. She was commissioned by the Vatican as part of the Pavilion of the Holy See at the 56th International Art Exhibition and represented Macedonia at the 55th International Art Exhibition La Biennale di Venezia. Alastair Forbes is visiting professor at the University of Tartu in Estonia. He is also emeritus professor of medicine at the University of East Anglia, where he was until August 2020 research director and clinical gastroenterologist. His scientific work is mainly in intestinal failure and nutrition in inflammatory bowel disease, but he is also committed to medical education and has a career-long interest in ethical issues and other points of interface with society more generally. He was proud to play an active role in the stage performances of Incontinentals, a light-hearted approach to the serious problem of facial incontinence. He was previously at UCL and St. Mark's Hospital in London. He has been educated director of the European Nutrition Society, general secretary of the British Society of Gastroenterology, and chairman of the British Association for Clinical Nutrition. He has written more than 250 original papers, many reviews and contributions to guidelines, and is widely cited. So after this maybe longer intro, I will just like to say that today's panel discussion, I expect to give some sort of answers to those particular questions. Can something of the scientific approach be of a value to the artist, or can something of the artistic approach be valuable to the scientists? In which way? So let's start this conversation with addressing primarily to Elpida. Elpi, can you tell us a little bit more about your art practice and when did you start working in collaboration with scientists?
Hi everybody. Well, I can go back quite a long time ago actually. I've lived a quite nomadic life, so moving and working with site and working quite a site specifically led me to being exposed to lots of different people, and my work and the research evolved from working with arboriculturists to foresters to food specialists to taxidermists, and then that slowly led me into the scientific matter of the work. I also do conservation work for people that don't know, and the conservation's been kind of parallel with my practice. And when I say conservation, I've worked on many kind of natural history monuments and buildings, and restoring and repairing and conserving which exposed me to lots of chemicals and treatments. And then that's become almost evolved in what I do for the rest of my career, really. So starting with a scientist, depends how who you call a scientist, but scientist is a very open field. But I met Professor Alistair Forbes in 2014 for a large project. We applied together to the Wellcome Trust for funding to do a collaboration, and then that evolved working in a quite sort of more controlled and more parallel way with looking at the research and my research and how I can influence and how I can feed from what the scientists were doing. So yeah.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit shortly and then more through your presentation, what sort of materials actually do you use in your art practice? Because that's very interesting part as well, which relate you with different kinds of different disciplines and professionals and scientists, of course.
Yes, yeah. I started working with trees and natural materials very, very early. And I've always been interested in the hidden and the exposing something that's hidden, something that we don't pay attention to. That includes particular spaces and cavities. So I've always been interested in trees and how trees grow above and below and what happens in that hidden space. So my materials range from working with roots, trees, branches, then moving into food production. So working with refusal and rejected materials such as skins, animal organs, products that we encounter on a regular basis that we don't even pay attention to. But the whole research process of my work and the site specificity led me to look at specific materials depending on the location I'm working with. So some projects include working with salmon skins, some projects include working with intestinal, some projects include working with stomachs, lining, and I work a lot with gold. So I use a lot of gilding in my work. So I bring the gold as a kind of a metaphor for evaluating or elevating a particular material that we've got no value to. So by adding the gold, I try to raise more awareness about that material and what that material it is really, and how we can use certain parts of certain food products that we constantly reject. So it's kind of making an importance of something that has no importance, if you like. But most of my materials are very difficult for lots of people because they line at that, they're all kind of hidden. I call them hidden materials that we don't pay attention to. So most of them come from the inner parts of the body. By talking about these materials, there's a double twist always to it. So when you discuss something, you talk about it, it sounds very ugly and almost unpleasant. But then when you look at it in a space and in a gallery or different spaces, then it gives a different feeling to the viewer. So I'll talk a bit more about this when I show some of the images and refer to those particular feelings and experiences through the work.
Super, thanks for answering a bit of my next question. Actually, in your working with scientists and different kind of professionals, do you find the usage of their knowledge just in the process of preparation, the material that you're using? Or you are as well using their scientific or professional knowledge and putting it into a particular new context? I mean, do you use the context of using the stomach parts or using the rat skins or whatever else do you use in your projects, do you use as well the second level, not just the preparation of the material that you are putting into the new work of art?
I think all those points are very, very important, starting from conversations, being part of the labs or operating theatres or working together with patients. And I've sat as an observer and I've sat as a participant. So all that feeds in my work, and those conversations are actually the most important thing, because that's what influences the work, and a lot of the knowledge and things that I learn through being with the scientist is very important, because it opens up a completely different avenues for different ideas, and also the materials, because you don't even anticipate how and what's available in terms of a matter and what happens to certain parts. And I mean, I've been part of as an observer in operating theatres where patients have been operated with cancer, in particular bowel cancers, and standing there just watching all this happening is quite fascinating for me. I guess a lot of people would find that quite revolting potentially, and they might be quite disgusted by it, because there's so much blood and there's so much going on that you have to have a really good stomach to be able to observe all that. But I find that actually drives so many ideas forward, and that space that we do not encounter it, or we are not aware of until something goes wrong, and then we start thinking about our body. I think it's been a quite big influence in my work and things I've been producing, for example, for the last 5-6 years in my career. And I hope that's the same thing for Alistair, who talk a bit later on about his kind of having me as part of the project. I think was quite interesting as well, because my work are quite challenging for lots of things to grasp, I guess.
Great. So before I invite you to share your presentation with us, so that the audience, the attendees, can see your works in through visual materials, I would just ask you about this point, which is directly related with our concept of the exhibition, actually the future ecologist concept. So how important do you think that we all discuss about these particular issues, which are very wide and very needed to be as much more frequently discussed and talked, especially in this correlation between art, science, which can be widely socially related to different kind of audience, and can have this kind of relation and communication with wider audience. How important do you think that it is to talk about the problems that we are facing with climate changes, with protection of our living surrounding, and politics, and everything else that goes on together with all these topics related to future ecologists?
I mean, I hope everybody would agree that it's the most important thing to actually start think, act, not just think and talk about it, but actually start acting about it and do something about it, because the way things are going, we are getting into a problematics that potentially generations ahead of us might have no place to deal with. But I think we're as a humans, we are probably the worst enemy to ourselves in terms of our ecology and our surroundings. And I'm hoping that, I mean, artists are pretty good at raising awareness of all these things, but I do hope that lots of the public would actually take something away from this exhibition and start acting on their own environment. And if we do a little bit for our own environment, then things would hopefully be better. And you see through my work, I'll be showing you, as I've chosen a selection of works which I think are quite important, that they're all even much earlier works, 2011, they all deal with bacteria and and viruses. So this has been part of many generations, but I think it's getting so closer to home now that we really need to start doing something about it in order to protect our climate and our own survival if we want to be here for future generations to come. So very important.
Thanks. So let's share now the visual presentation that you have prepared for our today's webinar, and let's share with the attendees some of the examples of collaboration with different kinds of professionals from different disciplines, scientists, and
we can go on the next slide, please. I've selected some works from the time, well, when I met Professor Alistair Forbes, we applied for funding to the Wellcome Trust for an exhibition, for a work called Making Beauty. The title, I think, says a lot in its name. The work was relating to looking at our bodies and our space, internal space, and I was very fascinated with our how we process food and what happens with our food, and looking at not just external but internally how our body reacts to certain bacteria, nutritions, viruses. So part of this exhibition, Making Beauty, there were two pieces also shown as part of the work, and one where you can see here on the left-hand side, Haruspex, which was the 56th Venice Biennale commissioned by the Vatican. And the same piece exhibited at Giannogli Gallery in 2016 in a very different configuration. The work here, I think, is very important to the work that I observed and looked at through Making Beauty, because it's all looking at how we reference things and what we do with matter. In particular, when we talk about our guts controls the brain, or the brain controls the guts. So all the work here is made out of lamb intestines and cow stomach in the middle called omasum, and the external space is made out of pig's inner layer, so pig's lining, called maramica in Macedonian. The interesting thing about this work, it's a space of rejected materials. I can touch up on the subject matter a little bit, but you can read that on my website. So what I want to talk more about is about this transfer of information and how we transfer information across space, and why we reject certain things and why we influence certain things. Can I get the next slide, please? The next slide is again another very large commission that was commissioned for Fabrica Gallery called Fragility. And the same work again shown at Giannogli Gallery in a very different configuration. In Fabrica Gallery, you've got this vascular space that deals with a very, very difficult subject matter of dying, but in fact is very beautiful and almost feels like a space of being in the clouds, where you just look at the light and how the light penetrates through the work. All the work here is again made out of pig's stomach lining, and then on the right hand side you've got a space which is almost like a tunnel, again configured to reference the work I was experiencing through the research, working with the scientists for about a year and a half. Most of it was through endoscopies, colonoscopies, looking at the body from internally out, externally. And this whole way of proceeding through the space and getting from one room to the next room, I think, is quite important. Can I get to the next slide, please? And the third space in the Giannogli Gallery was all the work produced as part of the research I did with the scientists for a year and a half. And this is what the Making Beauty exhibition was. So a lot of the works that you can see here are very domesticated scale works, quite small, made out of different stomachs, different lining, or mainly organs. We've got some 3D prototypes that I created, and some other works which you'll see in a minute. Next slide, please. I had a piece of work. You can see a lady there standing in a cow's stomach, called Indention of Self. If anybody's interested after the talk, you can go back onto my website where you can hear this 5-way conversation between 5 patients. It was very interesting working with these patients because we talked about very, very private things, dealing with bowels and how the bowels have failed them, and realizing how contracted to the bed they were in terms of why they couldn't actually leave the houses because it was such a big problem. When we discuss, a lot of people don't like talking about the bowel and how a bowel operates, and we like to talk about eating healthy and putting all these lovely nutritions in our body, but we don't want to talk about what comes out of our body. So this whole piece is about problems, and the way it's edited is there's segments of the conversation using just particular words that they used, such as poo, shit. I'm sorry, I'm going to be quite vulgar here, but there is, it was quite important to express this because at the time, none of them wanted to talk about it. Eventually they opened up, which I think is quite amazing. So next slide, please. This is a very, very small piece called A Carapace of Beauty, which is a baby cow's stomach. It's an Amazon. Cows got 4 stomachs, and this is a number 3 stomach. So I use this particular stomach a lot in my work because I think it's just so beautiful, but in the same time, it's rejected, and we do not eat it because it takes so long to be cleaned, so it's got no value to the market, so the sale price is just almost pennies. So I can get tons of this material because immediately it just goes in the bins, but in the same time it's a material that processes the food, so it's so important part of the stomach that actually cleanses the food, and it's got beautiful petals. It's also known as the Bible in butchery terms because it's so difficult to clean. So they're referencing the work to a Bible, which was quite interesting. The first piece that I showed you at the beginning, in the centerpiece, was the Omosum, or the Bible, in Haruspex as a centerpiece. Next slide, please. This particular series of 3 works are made out of lamb stomachs, and they're very much, you can probably see, influenced by endoscopy. So there are stomachs which are air dried, turned inside out, so you get these beautiful velvety textures exposing, and they've been probed with medical tubes, which are being covered in intestinal, and they have a domesticated objects on them. I wanted them to be kind of slightly have this twist, so the curtain rail handles are used as a balancing act. So this act of fragility and how easy it can be tipped over, or how easy it can be destroyed. So the work, even just blowing it with the air, can be tipped on side. So that kind of balancing act in life, which just plays quite a big hand, I think, in my work, is been referenced through this work, and also that collaboration of working with patients at the point where they're going through processes of discovering and how fragile that line is, having an endoscopy or colonoscopy test, and then you don't know what comes out. Do you have a cancer or you don't have a cancer? And having those conversations with patients going in and coming out was quite interesting process for me. So the influence on this works. Next slide, please. So this is again the third stomach. This one in particular is balancing on a pig's intestine. I use the pig quite a lot in my work because for lots of different reasons, but one of the reasons in this particular work is used because pigs' parts are also used in medicine quite a lot because they're so close to the human. So we use them for different rebuilding parts, so building scaffolds, or I'm sure Alistair might mention a bit more about this later, but that was quite fascinating for me to find out how close anatomically to the pig we are in terms of body parts. Next slide, please. There's two of these works which I put in the mix. They're very different to what I normally do. So this is a piece of work made out of a copper wire that comes from a speaker wire. So the speaker wire has been exposed and taken out, the plastic has been removed. They're called manometry 1 and 2, and the drawings on this manometry is a patient's diagram from being recorded under MRI scanning. So it's a quite interesting way of recording how the bowel works, for example, and they can figure out where there's blockages and where the patient's got a problem. So the actual drawing on this comes from one particular patient. They're quite three-dimensional. So the copper wire is stitched directly onto canvas, so it's quite time-consuming to make. So the images don't do much justice to this because they're actually quite beautiful to see in real, because you can see all the elevation of the pattern. Next slide, please. This is a work made out of cow fat again, which is the pig's cow fat. Again, influenced by some of the works going on in the labs, where you're looking under microscopes and lights, and how a particular light can change a material and turn it into something very, very different. What I love about these works is they work with the light and without the light, but when you turn the light on, they almost become like slightly translucent, too transparent, and very much you can see all the veins, internal veins on the skin as well, which again on these images, sorry to say, you can't really see that, but it's this kind of membrane of different patterns. Next slide, please. This is something called Bibles, influenced by one of the scientists' work, Caroline, that I worked with. She ended up slicing muscles from mice quite a lot, and freezing the muscle in a wax, a paraffin, and then the paraffin would be sliced, and then each slice would be looked under the microscope. And I worked quite closely with her for quite a few months, and then she would go through this whole process over and over and over again. And for me, that was so close to what I do, because I spent hours and hours getting a precision in making something, and then you reject it, and then you start again and again. So these particular boxes are filled with coal fat sheets, which comes from different projects that I've done, like, for example, Fragility and house specs. We've had quite a lot of sections which we had to cut off, but I don't throw anything away, so I use everything that I have in my studio. So I spend hours sitting down on my desk sometimes when I've got these blockages in my head, and then I remember, Caroline, that I cut these slices and then make them into boxes. So next slide, please. This is the other manometry. So this is another patient. So you can see the difference between the two panels, if you like, and how different a body image can look under MRI scan. It was, I mean, when you think back, on the outside, we all look slightly different. We have different size, different scale, different color, but on the inside, we look even more different to each other. So I think that was quite a fascinating process for me to see. Next slide, please. I included this work because this is probably quite early. This is a 2011 commission for Town, a gallery called Reoccurring Undulation, and it's work with salmon skins. I created this work based on the salmon's heartbeat and how closely the salmon was bred into. Is a farm salmon. So the fascination of how something can be bred to come out exactly the same size, and how that can be then processed and packaged. It's the beginning of something that I start to look into more and more, and I got more and more fascinated about how we consume our food and what we do with our food and what we buy, what we don't buy, and how much this whole kind of behavior of wanting the best meat or the best piece of salmon in a cling film packaged box create such a huge rejection of a perfectly other good salmon that doesn't look as nice, but it tastes maybe even better than the packaged one. So it made me think about this whole rejection and what the consumer does, and how that can be changed, and can it be changed. And then I created this work which is made out of 960 tiles. So it's almost like a tapestry on the wall, and each tile is a drawing of the heartbeat, and each tile kind of moves into the next tile. So from a distance looks like a charcoal drawing, but when you come closer, you realize that it is a skin. And hope that with doing this and showing the scale, and you probably noticed that the scale of my work is always quite large. So doing this on such a large scale, I'm hoping that people would influence how much we consume and what we do with the rest of it. Next slide, please. I should speed up a little bit. So this is Silentio Pathologia, and if you haven't seen the exhibition, I would advise you to go and see it. So this is slides from Venice Biennale, and it looks very different but very similar at National Gallery, Mala Stanica. So this work again is using materials which are completely rejected, materials which got no value to the market. So third grade silk cocoons, which is perfectly usable. As you can see, the black silk in the middle is being made with a third grade silk, but it takes a bit longer to produce, so presumably the price would be higher, but in fact is lower because we don't want to buy it. And then in the middle of this work, we've got the albino rats, which again this particular albino rats come from a food production chain that's for zoos and pet shops, and has the sale pass date, believe it or not. So the sale date on this was gone, so the rats would immediately go into the bin because they can't be fed to the animal. Next slide, please. I just want to show you the complexity of the work from above. In this, we had the metal skin on the outside, which we don't have in Mala Stanica, but it's dealing with, again, that hard shell and an inner body, which is the soft tissue of the body. and how fragile something can be with the middle section, which you've got the 2 cages inside the middle, and they have the alive black rats. It's a journey. It's a play space where you have to travel through the work to exit the work, and at the end of that exit, you come to the live matter. And I hope by seeing that live animal, you take something away with you that starts some beginning of something quite new and quite amazing. Next slide, please. I've put these few slides, which I am quite quickly through them, which is the other side of my work, which deals again with the disease and different type of disease in terms of nature, not just us, the humans, and how trees are very, very prone to disease and declining and slowly being disappearing really. So this was my experience first time in China, where I spent 3 months, and for the first time in my life I saw that tree can get a transfusion of fed. The trees are actually fed with and pumped with nutritions in order to survive. And then slowly through my research I've realized the only reason they're doing this because they create these artificial landscapes where the trees are moved on such a late age, sort of stage of their life that almost impossible to survive. So the only way they'll survive by being given a transfusion. So it's kind of fascinating to watch this, and within 3 to 6 months, maybe a year, the tree, if it's lucky, will survive. If it's not lucky, it'll just die. So the piece of work that I created is one of many part of an exhibition at A4 Museum. It's called Feed Me. So it's a root which has been turned upside down and gilded to the point of influenced by this kind of liquid passing through the veins, if you like. Next slide, please. Quite recent work, again, looking at disease and the Dutch elm disease, which has affected lots of elms. This is Nottingham University of Nottingham, called Eridis prevails. Next slide, please. Just want to show you a bit of a close-up. So you can see here we've got 2 trees, both upside down with a positive and a negative of the same pattern. The pattern derives from the beetle. A beetle creates these galleries, which is called feeding galleries. It's in the name, actually. And these feeding galleries eventually kill the tree inside out. So they basically, by burying themselves inside the bark and into the tree, they let this fungal that then eventually transfers to the root system, and then through the root system each tree just gets suffocated. So it's quite a horrible death. Next slide, please. What I'm working on currently, which is another elm, and this in particular elm is one of the most famous elms in Brighton. Is part of a twin called the Preston Park twin. It's 450 years old, and Shakespeare used to write his plays in these elms. It dates from 1623, so it's just amazing. So, but sadly, one of the elms was affected by Dutch elm disease last year, and they had to cut it down. It's got a 3-meter diameter and an internal cavity. Next slide, please. And the internal space is just so beautiful. It's just so fragile, but also so hard in the same time. On the left-hand side image, you can see all the beetle and the drawings that they created. The whole tree is just marked with these drawings from the beetle, almost like an elephant skin that's been affected by a disease. And the bottom slide is an image of the artist's impression, so that the work would be internally gilded, completely gilded, to elevate the beauty of the work its own space, and then the plan is to put it back in Preston Park when it's completed. We've just got the first funding for this and quite successful planning permission, so we are steaming ahead. So the work would be exhibited at Secret Garden first in April next year, and then would move to Preston Park in the summer. So I hope that a lot of people would continue to enjoy the tree back in next to its twin. And I think that's me for the moment. So maybe we can do some questions at the end.
Thank you, Elpida, for this fascinating presentation, which definitely showed all the attendees and all the audience that would like to follow us after, while sharing the recordings, about the how impactful can be the art interweaved with other disciplines, with science, with using the knowledge of other spheres which are not particularly a part of the fine arts or visual arts, but can definitely help into producing more knowledgeable and more deeper works of art, which really have a sense and really can share a bigger and a very powerful message to even viewer that it's not very much into knowledge of art or what shall art show to us. So now let's ask a little questions to Professor Forbes. So Professor Forbes, I don't know if this is the first deeper sight into what Elpida did through her career, or you knew what did she do until now? I mean, in such wider expanses.
Elpida's got a fantastic breadth of interests and knowledge, and while I haven't seen every last one of her images, the ideas that she's presenting are very familiar. These are things that we've many times talked about. I think there are so many different aspects that she's brought out that it would be, I mean, we could talk for 3 or 4 hours about the different possibilities. What about perhaps I wanted to hit on right to begin with is this idea of the hidden and the thing that needs to be discovered, because that is very, very key to medicine in the sense of diagnosis. And with a diagnosis, it's usually a question of a path through discovery towards something that's, at least when we reach a diagnosis, it's something that we know about and we know what that diagnosis is, even if it can be quite difficult to get there. But of course, if you take it to the next step into pure science, as opposed to medical science, which is very much an applied science, that unknown is actually the purpose of the research. And it is genuinely unknown until it's been found through science and refound and verified. I mean, it's no accident that we use the word research. And that's something I think that's often not well understood by lay people. They think that when a discovery is made, that's it. But it never is, because even the very best paper in the very best journal, we will always question. We'll say, well, that's very interesting. It's a good group. I know those people. I know those scientists. They're good people. They're honest people. And this is an interesting discovery. But I still don't believe it. Not yet. Not until 2 or 3 other groups that are also well established and trustworthy and sensible, until they've found the same thing, or at least something very similar. Then we believe it, and then that allows us to change our path. And I think it's that, if we talk about climate change and the threats to the environment, I think that's why we've been so slow to deal with it, because scientists always say, well, this is the 95% probability. It isn't certain, but it's jolly convincing. And when not 1, not 2, not 100, not 1,000, but tens of thousands of scientists have all said the same thing, then we can say, you know, it's still not fact, but it's getting very close to it. And someone else will come along. I mean, it's a characteristic thing in British broadcasting that there's this idea of balance. And so if we've got 10,000 scientists saying one thing, we have to have a lunatic saying the opposite so that there's balance. And this is quite a problem, because very often the very people who are most passionate about things are often the least informed. And I think it's influenced a lot of politicians, that they have allowed themselves to be persuaded that, for example, climate change doesn't exist or isn't anything like as bad as it says, because it suits them to believe that. And I think it's no accident that it's artists, it's performers that are leading a lot of the recognition in the lay public's mind as to these very important things. And I think it's not accidental. And I've got a little presentation I'll show you in a moment, and I'll make a few of the same points again. But I think that interface between the scientist, who has a particular way of doing things that isn't always especially well understood by the non-scientist, and the artist, who has in many ways a more global approach, someone who can think of things in a different way, but actually, perhaps, if one's honest, is closer to real people. Now, as doctors, we try to be close to real people, but I think we don't always succeed. And occasionally you get a very pleasant surprise when a patient says thank you, and it's clear that they've really understood what you were trying to do for them. But it's also the case that every now and again you have a patient who just clearly hasn't understood at all. And you thought you'd worked so hard, you'd been so careful, you tried to lead them along the path, and yet something quite basic hasn't quite clicked. And I think the artist is much better placed to identify that and to help us understand each other. And I suppose that communication channel is so very important. And it of course works in both directions. And Elpi's told you a number of examples of where her work has moved in both directions. And that's certainly true for me. Perhaps you'd like me to give my little presentation.
Yeah. We would like to see your presentation. Yes, please.
Okay, well let's do that and see if I can make the technology work. So we're going to try and get the screen sharing working. Let's see if that will do it. Looks promising. So what I've done is it's a very brief PowerPoint presentation, just with some of the things that I think are important, and that have drawn out some of the things that we've been talking about. So this linkage of arts and scientists, and the arts and the science, and what it might mean, particularly in medicine. So I've concentrated on medicine rather than the pure sciences, but a lot of the messages are the same. And I start with a comment about professionalism. Now, when we recruit people for medical school, professionalism is terribly important, and it's got to the point where I had to ask one group of medical students, potential medical students, they were coming for interview to be taken on as medical students, and they talked a lot about all of these things, and empathy and how to be a good doctor and sincere. And I said, was there anything else? And I really had to work hard to get them to say knowledge. So in some respects, we've got this right, that we are taking it very seriously, that we do recognise the importance of the ability of the doctor to have that interface with his patient, her patient. But also it's dependent on knowledge. And the same goes for ethics as well, which you've heard I have an interest in. We can't be ethical if we don't base our ethics on knowledge and admit when we don't have that knowledge. So professionalism, this is me giving a lecture. That's sort of what you expect of a professor in a medical school. And so that's the very opposite of what we think of as acting. And there's a continuing dialogue about this as to what acting is and how acting relates to medicine. And there are a number of people that think the two should be kept absolutely poles apart, that professionalism is the antipathy of acting. But actually, I'm not so sure. Because when it comes to it, when I've got a bad cold and I'm really thinking perhaps I'd have been better off staying at home, or the patient's one of those people who just won't stop talking when you've got another 100 people waiting to be seen, and the last thing you want is to listen to the story of their pet parrot. You want to move them on, but somehow you keep calm, even though you want to tell them to get out of the place, you keep calm, and that's professionalism. And what's that if it's not acting? And I think we use acting as part of our professionalism. That's actually an important part of medical work, and medical professionalism actually is acting. Elpida's shown you some trees, and of course another thing that's a very key part of being an academic doctor is publishing. And of course we, in the process of doing that, we get through an awful lot of trees. So you heard that I've written more than 250 papers, half a dozen books. There's an awful lot of trees there, but perhaps my use of trees is also constructive in the long run, in the same way that Elpida's use is. And of course, the other key use of trees in this context is in literature. And I was saying earlier, the importance of seeing things interpreted by others. I remember at school being given a definition of literature that really was writing that makes you think. And literature, for me at any rate, has been very important in medicine. It provides a different way to know our patients. When we read Dostoevsky writing about a doctor and a patient, when we read even maybe more trivial, someone like Oscar Wilde, looking at the interface between people, you say, I wouldn't really have thought about it like that. And it's funny, or it's sad, or it's tragic, or it's humorous. But it's different. And when we've read a good book, we apply things and we apply ourselves differently to the world. And I think that's very important. So what about the visual arts? We've heard a bit about books and acting, but the visual arts are also important. And Elpida's shown you that very clearly in her interactions with the natural world. It can also be very dramatic and very traumatic, and we don't have to be as graphic as Picasso was, but you can see that was an immensely powerful work. It was immensely powerful as a piece of art, but surely much more so because of what it told us about people and people's experiences. And I think that's something that comes up again and again in my discussions with all sorts of artists. And again, artists are beginning to be involved in our assessments of science. And again, Elpida's told you a few things there. And many medical schools around the world now use actors as mock patients in student exams. And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's more objective. You can be sure that the actor will give the same story every time to every student that they're interviewed by. So it's more repeatable. The actor doesn't mind being there from 9 till 5, giving the same story 20 times. A real patient might get a bit tired. Probably wouldn't even be ethical to do that. And of course, alongside the actor is the professional, the doctor, the professor who stands there and marks the student. But we realised pretty early on that was rather insulting, rather demeaning to the actor. They are, after all, potential patients and they're human beings. So it was thought quite early on, well, we should let the actors mark the students as well. And to be honest, I think everyone thought that was just a little bit of political correctness and being civil and polite. And the marks were actually going to be thrown in the bin without telling the actors. So the actors were allowed to give a grade. But the interesting thing was when the actors were allowed to give the grade and you looked at the grade, the actors' grades were almost identical as those of the professors and senior academics, even for highly technical aspects. So somehow the real person, who in this case was an actor, was able to assess the student just as well as the person that was the expert. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? Now, I think you heard in my biography at the beginning that I've been involved in some other things, and Incontinental was a review about fecal incontinence, and there aren't many worse things to happen to you than becoming fecally incontinent, where you can't control the bowel, and maybe in the supermarket, maybe when you're collecting your child from school, just out in the street, or when you've had sex in bed, suddenly your bowels are open without you having any control over it. there aren't many things in life that are more unpleasant than that. And of course, as Elpi's told you, we don't talk about it. It's difficult to get patients to talk about it, even when they come to see me as a bowel doctor. I have to ask the question. When they've told me about diarrhea, I have to say, and are you ever incontinent? And about half the people I ask that question say, well, yes, actually. And they haven't volunteered it. That's how scary it is. So, my role, lecturer, but also in Incontinental, trying to bring the topic of fecal incontinence to a broader public. And we had a lot of fun with it. So this is a group of musicians, artists, actors, all working together using a lot of material that we got from websites and from a blog run by a group of patients with incontinence. And it was great fun. I acted as a narrator, giving the serious stuff, but not so much as to avoid the little bit of fun and games at the end. Those blown up gloves made the most wonderful farting noise as they were let off. So that was the grand finale. But what I didn't show you was when I was doing my serious lecture and I was actually talking about the appearances on ultrasound scans and the mortality data and the days missed from work and lots of quite serious things like that, I was also being challenged a little bit because that photo I show you there on the left isn't quite unedited. That was how it actually was. So you get an idea of the sort of things that we got up to. But that interface, the multidisciplinarity of it, is very, very important for a lot of the things that I do. So I can stop sharing now and come back to see you in the flesh. And hopefully that will have been an extra stimulus for some additional discussion.
Thank you, Professor Forbes, for sharing this interesting presentation with us. Will you share some of the experiences while working with Elpida on her project?
Well, I suppose it started with complete ignorance on both sides. I had no idea what she was trying to do. She certainly didn't know what nanotechnology was when she came to talk to me. So a lot of it was the metaphorical equivalent to two people speaking completely different languages, trying to communicate in sign language, I suppose, wasn't it? Would that be fair, Elpida?
Yes, very much so, yes. I remember our first meeting when I came in and I was trying to talk you into applying with me for this funding. And you were very serious to start off with until we got talking about your project, which you just shown. And then I thought, okay, we could get on together quite well. But no, it was we both kind of started with, I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. I wanted to kind of get involved and I wanted the scientific work to kind of lead the work that I would produce. So it was very much an open book, wasn't it?
Mm. Oh yeah, absolutely. And we fed off each other and in an almost literal sense as well, because you became so interested in the inside of the gut, which of course is home territory for me, at least some of the time. And that it's not ever routine, because when you're looking inside someone's stomach, inside someone's colon, it's never routine for them. And although it might seem that way for the doctor, it is always a very special life event for the patient. And we try to respect that. But actually, it's very interesting, and it's also influenced by comical things as well. And I remember this some years ago now, and we had a visiting doctor from Canada who was quite new to colonoscopy, so the endoscopic examination where we look inside the colon. And we'd had a bad run of what we call bad prep. Now, bad prep simply means that although the patients had a whole load of laxatives, there's still a lot of, now what did you want to call it? Poo inside. There's still a lot of poo, which stops you getting a decent view. And if you're looking for a small polyp, which might even be a small cancer, if there's a lot of poo around, you're not going to see it. And that could make the difference between you finding it and the patient having a procedure that saves their life just through an endoscopy, or a cancer developing that 2-3 years down the line kills them. So it's actually really rather important. And this Canadian doctor, she was very funny. And as I say, we'd had a bad run. We had 2 or 3 patients on the trot who hadn't really had very good clear outs. And then the next patient was the patient that she was going to be doing the procedure. And she was very excited about it because it was going to be the first time she'd done it in London. And so she was very much on edge, but also very, very excited, and knew that we were all going to be watching because this was part of the training program. And it was a beautifully clear preparation, so you could see absolutely all the lining of the colon absolutely smoothly and perfectly. And she went into raptures, and then suddenly she stopped and burst into giggles and said, this must be the most stupid thing. They're saying, how can this be beautiful? But of course, Elpida, you know exactly how it's beautiful, and of course she could see how it was beautiful in a real way as well as in this slightly technical procedure-related way. But I think we do need to take a step back every now and again and look at things and say, yeah, actually that is beautiful in that true sense. It's not pretty necessarily, but it's beyond pretty. It's true beauty.
Definitely. I mean, for me, I after the work we did together, I ended up going and collecting some cow rectums from an abattoir, and I didn't realize how. I mean, this might sound disgusting to somebody in the participants, but I apologize in advance. How velvety and how much. It was almost like a soft velvet, the whole internal space. Mm-hmm. And this is where the most of the senses are, isn't it? Where and all the kind of, how can I call them, like end of the nerves and
yeah, well, the physiology there is phenomenal. And it's funny actually, because this was one of the things I included in Incontinentals. I got the audience to imagine, I don't know whether people can see, but to cup your hands like that. And then what we're going to do is to put some clay, soft clay in there. And then we're going to fill it up so that we've made a sort of cup shape. There's a bit of soft clay. And then we're going to put some water on top. And then, of course, there's air on top of that. And then when you've got that, hold it carefully. Hold it so you get the audience to do this. And we did this with Incontinental. I had the entire audience sitting in the hall doing this. And I said, okay, now what I want you to do is to let the air out, but none of the water and none of the gas and none of the clay. And of course, everyone just laughs, and it's totally impossible. Of course it is. But actually, that's what the anal sphincter does all the time. It's able to make that distinction between flatus, the gas. We all pass a bit of gas. I mean, women don't admit it, but they still do it. and if you've got a bit of a runny tummy and you've got a bit of diarrhea, you can still make that distinction. And the sphincters, that whole physiological mechanism, is very sophisticated. And when it goes wrong, it's quite a problem. You're absolutely right. So that's the beauty of the physiology, with it maybe not so easy to see, but in terms of its function, there's a beauty of function for sure.
Professor Forbes, may I ask you a question? Did you sometimes ask yourself, what does Elpy want to see in this medical procedures? What is the beauty into it that she is reaching? Or what's the final destination that she wants to reach? I mean, did you sometimes put into her place,
It's an interesting question, because in a way it was a challenge, because I said, a lot of what we do is not very visual. I'm not sure that you'll see things that are interesting, but I also was very conscious of the fact that what I thought she might want to see probably wasn't what she actually wanted to see. And that proved to be correct. And the things that found most resonance with her weren't at all the things that I'd kind of predicted might be interesting for her. And to be honest, she found so many more things interesting than I thought she would. And so, it was just as well that I didn't try and blinker it or point her down a very narrow route. And perhaps if I'd done that, the collaboration wouldn't have come to anything. So I think it was very important that well, it's that old saying, isn't it? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That is true, but the beholder looks at things in completely different ways. It's almost as though they've got different eyes, and perhaps it's not even just eyes, because it's also feel. And you will have realized that a lot of what Elpida's been saying has a lot to do with feel. She talks about velvet, she talks about being inside, those sensations that are actually nothing to do with the pure visual. And I think that that's very important for me as well. And it comes back to what I was saying before about trying to understand a patient, trying to understand a scientific problem, trying to get inside that and to look at it in a different way. That is important and can be quite difficult. And we very readily shut those doors. It's very easy to live in our own particular environment and not see the things the other side of the door.
But it's also what you just touched on, I think is quite important, it's not just about the visual, but it's all about all your other senses, like the smell, what you hear, which I always try and capture in whatever I do or I create, because I think that sense of smell is something that's so much more stronger than anything else and stays with you. So that memory of a smell, we don't forget. You might forget memory of a visual, but the smell, as soon as something resonates, that smell, you come back to that place. I think that for me is quite important.
It's interesting. I thought you would probably not choose to talk very much about the smells, because so many of the things you have done have been absolutely disgusting smells. But of course you're right. I mean, smell is actually the most primitive of our senses, and it's no accident that it's therefore the most enduring. And most of us can think of 3 or 4 key smells from our childhood that immediately take us straight back to that time. And for different people it will be different things, but things like cut grass or baking bread or coffee or the smell of a particular place. I mean, I remember very vividly the smell of my hairdressers from when I was a small child, and they're very particular smells that you can immediately are transported back there in the way sometimes will happen with a piece of music, but it's more visceral with smell. So yeah, definitely.
Super. Now I think it's time to ask the attendees if they want to raise a hand and then be active into asking question with face and sound. So I will ask the administrator if there is some of the attendees that would like to ask questions to let them in this conversation. And in between, I may ask you, Professor Forbes, another question. What can you tell us as learning from this collaboration with Elpida? What is the experience that you will be richer with after this collaboration? And would you like to collaborate in the future with other artists on other projects in different fields?
Very much so. I mean, I think it is always valuable to be encouraged to think outside your own particular box, and it does require a certain amount of courage, because you put yourself open to criticism, and you also, in much the same way that you do when you are teaching, you expose your own ignorance. And it's not an accident that people say you only really know a subject when you teach it, because students, and I use that term in the broadest way, not just medical students or university students, but students of life, do ask difficult questions, and they don't always know that they're difficult questions. And it's for that reason that I always prefer teaching first year students to final year students. Final year students always ask quite predictable questions that are related to their forthcoming exams, whereas the first year students ask just things that are interesting. I've got a 7-year-old, he asks questions that are interesting. A stupid question. And then you think about it, well, actually, it seems like a stupid question, But now I think about it, I don't know the answer, and I don't know why. You know, it's the sort of question, why is the sky blue? That kind of question that we ought to be able to answer really simply and easily. But I look it up every time I think about it, and I can never remember exactly why. It just doesn't quite bite. And it's exactly that interface that I have with all the different types of artists that I've worked with. They ask questions that are quite different from the final year medical students. They ask questions that make me ask questions of myself, and they make me ask questions of what we think of as the orthodoxy of medicine and indeed of science more generally. And they're very humble in the way they do it. And that makes it even more difficult to answer, because there's no question of saying, "Don't go away, stupid question." It needs to be thought about very carefully. And the question is being asked because it's important to them for a reason that maybe isn't even obvious to them at the time. But it's then a route into something more important. And ultimately, perhaps we don't solve the world's problems, but it gives us a better base for dialogue and a better base for understanding each other. And we can see so many examples around the world at the moment of where that's not happening and where that's creating a lot of problems for mankind. And if we could get politicians to join us, maybe that's our next collaboration. Elpida and me and a politician.
That would be
nice.
Nice collaboration with politicians.
That'd be really fun.
The next one. So we have a few questions for Elpida. What is her opinion on recreational plastic surgery and anthropodermic artistry in general, the artifice of human skin?
Gosh.
If you want to give the answer, of course, or if you know what to answer to this question.
Well, my opinion to that, I mean, depends how it's done. Sometimes can be done very tastefully and sometimes can be done quite untastefully. I have been interested recently looking into plastination of the skin and how we can reproduce the skin, which could be quite beautiful. But I think it always looks plastic. It doesn't look real.
Natural.
No matter how well it's done, always looks quite plastinated, I guess. So apart from that, I don't have a much of an opinion. I'm hoping, I'm doing some sampling myself to see if I can use that, but so far haven't succeeded. So.
The next one is for Professor Forbes. Does he find that the beginning of the Oath of Hippocrates, life is short, the craft is long, cover equally well the craft of physicians just as well as an artist?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, the Hippocratic Oath is usually used in a somewhat modified form these days, because there are quite a lot of things that it doesn't include in the original form, and some things that we think are maybe a little bit historic. And so in my medical schools, we've used a slightly updated modern version of it, but the principle is exactly the same. And I think that principle, the idea of the practitioner as teacher is very, very sound, and practitioner as teacher and practitioner as always learner. So from the day you start as a student, and let's say a student of anything, to the day you die, you should be aiming to continue learning. And I'm quite sure, apart from anything else, it helps to keep us young. It's actually self-preserving as well as good for other people. It's good for us ourselves. So I think there are many things about the Hippocratic Oath that are very, very pertinent to lots of people that aren't doctors or anything even vaguely like doctors. And so let's get all the artists to take the Hippocratic Oath as well. That's why not. But the central ideas of not harming, well, that's obviously something we would all sign up to. But the idea of always being a teacher and giving your knowledge and always being a learner and absorbing the knowledge of other people. I was going to say taking the knowledge, but that's a bit aggressive. But allowing other people's knowledge to enter you, that I think is terribly important, and it certainly is absolutely crucial to remain a contemporary active doctor. But I think in lots of disciplines that could be a very important lesson too.
Thank you. The next one is for Elpida. Does a Flashcrafter like Elpida envision her work before realizing it, or does she discover it firsthand after beginning the journey?
That's an interesting question. I always start with the site. So the concept develops through the research of that site, and then the materials come through the research. And I develop ideas, but then once I start working with the material or what I'm creating, usually changes. And also the influence of people working with me can have an impact on the outcomes. So it's kind of like a long journey in terms of collaborative way of working and very close relationship with the material, and then what that material can do and what I can do with it. And but I do start with a concept, and it's usually quite scary because I can never try this out until it's fully completed. So a lot of the work that I showed you, the big installations, I make them and create a space, but we don't know if it's going to work until it's actually installed. So it's quite a nerve-wracking process, really.
You've made some interesting points along the way as well about the sheer hard work and the tedious repetitiveness of a lot of the process, and there are a lot of parallels there with scientific experimentation as well, because we will generally start with a big hypothesis, which is, if you like, your big plan, and that is a risky business too, because if we choose the wrong hypothesis, we can spend literally years of work chasing our tails, doing a whole mass of work with absolutely nothing to show for it at the end. And if we've got nothing to show for it at the end, that means we won't get any funding for our next research grant, and the whole group can fall apart because of one bad decision. But that repetitive hard work aspect, I think, is common to both. And I think the idea that any sort of artist just turns up on the day, does a quick squiggle and that's it, it's just not like that, is it?
No.
Okay, the next one is for Professor Forbes. Do seasoned doctors like Professor Alastair still find beauty in biological systems like anatomical structures and larger scale physiology?
Yes, I mean, it would have to be said, not every minute of every day, because there's an element of the daily grudge. But yes, of course you do. And I think it's not only in the beauty of the physical things that you can see, but also the beauty of the interaction with the patient. And sometimes you'll have done a really busy outpatient clinic or endoscopy list, whatever it happens to be, and at the end someone will say something or behave in some way that you just think that makes it all worthwhile. And I think that is a different sort of beauty, but it's very much there, and it's not usually the person that's terribly effusive and comes with a box of chocolates. It's not usually that. It's usually much more subtle than that, but much deeper, and there's a real beauty in that, yes, for sure. And I guess it's that keeps a lot of doctors and nurses. It's not unique to doctors. It's anyone involved in looking after other people. That there are those little beautiful moments that make it very much worthwhile. Yes.
For LP, whether your art is more in line with a memento mori mentality, or more of a grandeur of present life mentality?
I say a bit of both, actually. I like the whole. I guess I like the whole darkness and showing the light of the darkness, but also I like the presence of being and opening up all those senses that we talked about, the thinking, the talking, the taking away. So yeah, a bit of both, I guess.
And you like going to Venice every couple of years
Yes, Venice is a very special place, but Venice is very dark too. So
absolutely,
it gives both sides of the story.
Yes,
so yeah, definitely.
It's got this fun effect, doesn't it? But actually, it's got the darkest history ever.
Yeah. I think that Elpida already answered the following question, but let's read it once again. Do you see some beauty in pathology or just in healthy body parts?
Well, I probably see beauty in pathology more than a healthy body parts, because as I showed and I spoke about it, I see beauty in decay, in changes, in cancers, in diseases, and fungal, and so I guess it's the mortality of a material that actually creates.
I think some of that is that it's intrinsically more interesting, and it comes back to what I was saying before about that difference between pretty and beautiful. And the normal might be pretty, but it may not be beautiful in quite the same way. That the pathological thing can be maybe harsh, maybe dark, but beautiful in that way.
Yeah,
I think maybe that's the way I would see it. Because certainly a lot of things that we see that are pathological are actually very interesting and captivating to look at.
Definitely.
And I mean, who hasn't seen pictures of the coronavirus? That's pretty, isn't it?
Yeah.
Who doesn't like the coronavirus?
And the last question is for Professor Forbes. Has collaborating with artists made any change to your approach to patients?
Yes, definitely. Although it would be quite difficult to say one particular instant example, but I think that the whole approach of listening to people and being maybe a little more patient when I haven't understood what they're getting at, and realizing from my working with all sorts of artists that off the beaten track question is often the most important one, and that definitely has changed how I work with patients. Yes, it has. And I think to mutual benefit, it's I hope to help the patients, but it's also helped me. It's made things more interesting, and hopefully that's made me a better doctor.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the attendees for their interest and for their very intriguing questions. I think that this conversation can go on for hours and hours. It's a never-ending story, and it's very inspiring, definitely. And what we are trying to do with this conversation here is as well to empower or to motivate the new generations to practice this kind of inter and transdisciplinary collaboration, because it really gives a better impact, it really gives better researches, it really brings better, wider and deeper projects into life in different levels. What we were trying to do as well, and we did collaboration in terms of the Touch, the future ecologists in Skopje. We did a collaboration between the Fine Arts faculty and the faculty for Natural Sciences and Mathematics. And it went really good. It really ended in 3 realized works of art as a part of their collaboration. So we really showed that this kind of collaboration can function with a very flourishing in our Macedonian conditions as well. So that's why we need to continue this kind of collaboration and practice them more frequently on different kinds and different levels of education and collaborations. So at the end, I will ask Elpida or Professor Forbes if you have something else to add before we conclude this conversation.
I'd like to say one very important thing. We've been talking a lot about communication, and we ought to thank our interpreter.
Definitely. Jana, thanks for translating this probably difficult conversation for a translation. But I'm sure that you did it very well.
I'm sure.
So Elpida, do you want to say something else at the end?
I think it's just so beautiful to be able to do these kind of conversations in especially difficult times, and we all sitting in different parts of the world actually. So Corona's been quite bad for lots of things, but maybe it's created a different platform for people to engage. But I hope that this platform changes and we can do our next event in person instead.
Live.
I hope so too.
Yeah. Definitely, it will give another dimension. Definitely. So thanks once again for participating on this art talk. I'm sure that we will have another chance for meeting, talking, or collaborating in life, in personal. So I will just invite all those attendees and the viewers that haven't seen the exhibition at National Gallery in Mala Stanica to see it, because it really gives very different points of view to this specific topic of future ecologies, which is very important, and we shall talk and discuss about it very frequently. And finally, thanks to British Council and Lux for giving us the opportunity for making the exhibition and producing this educational or public engagement program that involves different disciplines, different persons, different professions into one place. So thanks all for attending, and you can see the whole talk recordings of the talk on YouTube channels and on the page of National Gallery on Facebook. So who wants can watch it once again. So bye, have a nice evening, and let's go on with talking about this particular topics. Bye-bye.
Everybody, bye.